April 26, 1980, Manchester, New Hampshire. The mother of 14-year-old Laureen Rahn returns to their apartment building and discovers that the light bulbs in the hallways on all 3 floors have been unscrewed. When she enters her apartment, she discovers that one of Laureen's friends is sleeping in her bed, but Laureen herself is nowhere to be found. Over the next few years, Laureen's disappearance would feature a number of strange leads, including a series of mysterious unexplained phone calls and alleged ties to pornography. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode number 6 of The Trail Went Cold. I am your host, Robin Warder, and today's case is another request from a listener. As I've mentioned here before, I am a frequent poster in the Unsolved Mysteries forum at the Sitcoms Online message board. I was recently contacted by a fellow poster named Unsolved88, who sent me a list of suggestions of lesser-known missing persons cases that they wanted me to cover on this podcast. So thank you for that, Unsolved88. And in the end, the selection I chose to go with was the 1980 disappearance of a 14-year-old girl named Laureen Rahn. And one of my main reasons for choosing this one is because I actually covered this case in one of my earliest articles at listverse.com called 10 Mysterious Disappearances with Bizarre Clues. And it was published in April of 2013. And I do believe that is an apt title for the article because this case is nothing but a series of bizarre clues. It's one of the strangest missing persons cases I've ever come across, as there are so many weird details to pore through. But since this isn't a very well-known case, there aren't a lot of sources of information available for it, so it's really hard to figure out how a lot of these weird details fit together. But I'm going to give it my best shot. But first, I want to thank all my listeners and supporters out there, which seems to be growing with each episode. In particular, I want to thank my thus far small but very loyal band of Twitter followers, along with everyone from the Unsolved Mysteries forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit for your supportive feedback and comments on my first few episodes. The Trail Went Cold runs on a bi-weekly schedule, and a new episode is posted every other Wednesday. We've got our own Facebook and Twitter pages, and we're also available for download on iTunes, so if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. Of course, I need to provide the obligatory shout out to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and is my fellow co-owner of The Back Row, the pop culture website which hosts this very podcast. And also a big shout out to Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. Before I get started, I just want to reiterate that there isn't a lot of information about this particular case online, so my main source for a lot of the details I'm going to be talking about is a website called The Charlie Project, which really deserves a plug. The reason The Charlie Project deserves this major plug is because it is probably the best resource for researching missing persons cases on the internet, and it has given me so much material for many of the mystery and true crime articles I've written about these last several years. If you're a true crime fan or a kind of interested in missing persons cases, I'd advise checking the Charlie Project out because once you get started, you can get lost in that site for hours. And amazingly, this site is run entirely by one person. Her name is Megan Good, and she has single-handedly assembled this vast missing persons database over the course of the last decade or so. The way it works is that she takes every piece of information she can find online about a particular missing persons case, and she will assemble all this information together into one long written summary. I guess the drawback to this is that sometimes only vague bits and pieces of information about a particular case are available online. So when you attempt to assemble all these bits and pieces together into one written summary, certain parts of the story are not going to make much sense and are going to have some holes and leave you with some unanswered questions. And that certainly holds true with Laureen Rahn's disappearance, as the Charlie Project's write-up on the case has so many elements where I'm just itching to learn more details. But unfortunately, that information just isn't out there. But I'm going to still work with what I have, so let's begin, shall we? Our story starts off in Manchester, New Hampshire in 1980. Our central figure is Laureen Rahn, a 14-year-old high school girl who lives in an apartment building with her mother, Judith Rahn. I know that Laureen had a sister, but I'm not entirely sure if she was living with them at that time. I don't have any details about Laureen's father, but I do know that her mother had a boyfriend who was a professional tennis player. Anyway, on the evening of April 26th, Judith was scheduled to go out of town to see her boyfriend play in a tennis tournament. Even though Laureen usually went to these tournaments, she asked her mother if she could stay home that night because she was on her spring break from school, and Judith agreed to her request. So Judith goes and attends the tournament and returns sometime after midnight. And this leads to the first of many, many bizarre details in this story. When Judith goes into the apartment building, she discovers that the whole place is dark because all of the light bulbs have been unscrewed in the hallways of all 3 floors. No, not just the floor Judith lived on. Someone went to the trouble of unscrewing the light bulbs on all 3 of the building's floors. That is just so weird. Anyway, Judith reaches her apartment and discovers that the front door is unlocked. When she walks inside, she then notices that the back door is open. Judith checks Laureen's room, and it initially appears that Laureen is sleeping in her bed. But at some point, she realizes that it's not Laureen, but one of Laureen's female friends sleeping over. When the friend wakes up, she tells Judith that Laureen was supposed to be sleeping on the couch. And they do find a blanket and pillow on the couch, but Laureen herself is missing. Now, here is the first of many frustrating elements of this case, as there appears to be some conflicting information here. The Charlie Project page makes it sound like Judith did not discover that Laureen's friend was in her bed until morning. However, Laureen's missing persons profile page at the New Hampshire Department of Justice website, it claims that Judith contacted the police at around 3:45 a.m., so I'm not entirely sure which account is accurate. And here's another confusing detail. The Charlie Project page reads, "Her clothes and brand new sneakers were in the living room." Well, I'm presuming that Laureen wasn't naked when she disappeared, so at first I took this to mean that Laureen had gotten dressed in pajamas or a nightshirt or something, which is why it said her clothes were left behind. But that very same page also has a section with a description of the clothing she was last seen wearing, and it lists a white V-neck sweater, blue plaid blouse, jeans, and brown shoes. So if Laureen was last seen wearing these clothes, why does the write-up say her clothes and brand new sneakers were in the living room? Did she change into the sweater, blouse, and jeans to go sleep on the couch? Now, keep in mind, I'm not knocking the Charlie Project for this contradictory information. I'm just pointing out that these sort of things happen when you're assembling a missing persons profile out of bits and pieces of information that are scattered all over the internet. And this is just one of the many aspects of this case which leaves me with unanswered questions. Anyway, Judith did report her daughter missing, but since there were no signs of struggle anywhere in the apartment, the police initially believed that Laureen was a runaway. And I talked about this a little bit in my earlier episode about the Fort Worth 3 case, but unfortunately this was a fairly common mentality with cases involving missing teenagers in the 1970s and early 80s. Before the laws got changed, police would often just write off a lot of missing teens as runaways and just didn't do a proper investigation, even if there was nothing to suggest that the victim had run away. In Laureen's case, she apparently left her clothing, sneakers, and her purse behind in the apartment, so this really did not fit the profile of a runaway. But thankfully, the police finally did change their tune a few weeks later and leaned towards the idea that Laureen might have stepped out of her apartment for a brief period before she was taken against her will. Now, Laureen's female friend, she claimed that a male friend of theirs had joined both her and Laureen in the apartment that night, and that they all spent the evening drinking alcohol. The police questioned this male friend, who confirmed being there. He claimed that at one point, he heard voices in the apartment hallway and assumed that Laureen's mother was returning home. And since Laureen was underage and they were all drinking alcohol together, he was worried that he'd get in trouble, so he slipped out the apartment's back door. And curiously, he also claimed that he heard Laureen locking the door behind him, but when Judith returned home later that night, she found the back door wide open. And in a strange turn of events, this same male friend actually wound up committing suicide in 1985. However, the police have apparently never considered this guy a suspect in Laureen's disappearance, so I have no idea if his suicide has any relation to this case at all. Is this story not strange enough for you yet? Well, guess what, folks? It's going to get even weirder. Several months later, Judith was surprised to discover that 3 unexplained phone calls to California were on her phone bill. The calls took place on October 1st, 1980, but Judith never made these and really had no reason to, since she didn't know anyone in California and no one from her family had any ties to the area either. 2 of these calls were made from a motel in Santa Monica, and at first I was really confused by the wording of this. How did Judith's phone number in New Hampshire get charged for phone calls which were placed from Santa Monica, California? Well, I did a little research and discovered how this would be possible. I was only 2 years old during this time period, so of course I have no memory of this, but apparently in 1980, there was a way you could charge long-distance phone calls to your phone number from anywhere in the world. It's hard to imagine now, but remember, this is still many years away from the invention of cell phones. From what I've read, you could call the phone company first, and then enter a special PIN number, which would allow you to charge the call to your own phone number. This was apparently a lot cheaper than just call and collect. Now, of course, if Judith had one of these PIN numbers, you have to assume she gave it to Laureen at some point. So unless someone else managed to obtain Judith's PIN and used it to charge some random phone calls to her account, this seemed like a good indication that Laureen was still alive and somehow had made it all the way to California. And the rabbit hole is only going to get even deeper on this one, folks. One of the calls on Judith's phone bill was made to a teen sexual assistance hotline, which was run by a physician in California. The police questioned this physician, but he denies knowing anything about this call. But then, for reasons completely unknown, the physician changes his story about 5 years later. He claims that runaway girls often visited his wife at their home in California, and that at one point, he may have encountered a girl around Laureen's age who said she was from New Hampshire. And then, the physician directs investigators towards Annie Sprinkle, a famous porn star from this time period. Apparently, Annie Sprinkle used to work with this guy's wife in the fashion industry, and he claimed she might have information about these runaways he had encountered. Now, Laureen had always dreamed of becoming an actress someday, so there's speculation that she might have traveled to California to follow her dream, but wound up in the pornography industry. And apparently, investigators actually watched some of Annie Sprinkle's films to see if Laureen might be in any of them. And we're talking about titles like Deep Inside Annie Sprinkle and Twilight Pink, but it seems this lead went absolutely nowhere. And quite frankly, I have no idea what to make of any of this. I looked into Annie Sprinkle's background, and yes, she did do a lot of adult films during the 1970s and 80s, but she seems to have had a pretty successful post-porn career. She went on to earn a doctorate in human sexuality, and to this day, she's a fairly prominent feminist figure in the world of sexual education. And from what I've seen, Miss Sprinkle seems to be a pretty well-adjusted person who managed to avoid the self-destructive lifestyle that a lot of porn stars from that era fell into. I see nothing in her background to suggest she might be involved in the sex trafficking of runaway teenage girls, so I don't think the authorities believe that Sprinkle has any connection at all to Laureen Rahn's disappearance, and I have no earthly idea why this physician brought her name into this in the first place. But that's not the only confusing part. Like I said earlier, the two other mysterious phone calls charged to Judith's number had been made from a motel in Santa Monica and were placed to another motel in Santa Ana. In 1986, Judith had an investigator travel to California to check these motels out. And here is an exact quote I'm going to read from the Charlie Project page. Authorities said that one of the establishments may have been used by a child pornographer named Dr. Z. Investigators were unable to link Dr. Z to the teen hotline, and it is not known if pornography is involved in Laureen's disappearance. I'm sorry, what? I apologize. I'm sorry, folks. I would really like to provide some more context about those sentences I just read, but that's literally all the information I have. See what I mean when I said this case has many different bits and pieces which don't fit together? We've got two sentences which briefly mention this child pornographer named Dr. Z, but nothing else. This is why this case is so frustrating. Now, this is pretty much all the information I have about those three particular phone calls from California, but there's still more bizarre stuff involving phone calls. For about 1 year following Laureen's disappearance, her mother started receiving strange phone calls at her apartment. These calls would always come at around 3:45 a.m., and the caller would just stay silent before they hung up. Then another weird tradition would occur, as Judith would keep receiving calls around the Christmas holidays for the next several years. This time it was usually Laureen's sister who answered the phone, and once again, the caller would stay silent before hanging up. These calls eventually came to an end when Judith moved to Florida and changed her phone number. Of course, it's been theorized that these calls might have been from Laureen, but that's not all. In 1986, the mother of a childhood friend of Laureen's named Roger Moraes, she received a strange phone call from a female who claimed to be Roger's ex-girlfriend, and she identified herself by a name which sounded like Laureen. But as far as I know, this person never called back, so no one knows for sure if it was Laureen. And if this story wasn't convoluted enough, there are still some other intriguing clues. 6 months after Laureen disappeared, a 26-year-old Manchester woman named Denise Deneau also went missing. She lived only 2 blocks away from Laureen's apartment, and even though there was a 12-year age difference between the two females, they apparently looked pretty similar. But unfortunately, I can't really confirm that myself because there is literally zero information about Denise Deneau's disappearance anywhere online. Like seriously, there isn't even a photograph of her. No vital statistics, nothing. The only reason I even know of her existence in the first place is because she's mentioned on the Charlie Project page. But it's also worth mentioning that on March 22nd, 1980, a 15-year-old girl named Rachel Garden also went missing, and she went missing from the town of Newton, New Hampshire, which is approximately 35 miles away from Manchester. Unlike Denise Deneau, there is a photograph available for Rachel Garden online, and she does have a bit of a resemblance to Laureen. On the night Rachel disappeared, she was last seen purchasing some items from a corner market and was walking towards her friend's house, but she never arrived and no one ever saw her again. The only major lead is that Rachel was seen talking with 3 men in a car near the market, and all of these guys were known for being involved in criminal activity. At some point, one of them allegedly confessed to killing Rachel and provided police with a location where her remains were supposed to be buried, but they didn't find anything, so no one knows if this confession was genuine or not. It's never been conclusively established if the disappearances of Rachel Garden or Denise Deneau have any connection to Laureen's disappearance, but it is an intriguing possibility. And finally, we have reached the end of summarizing all the bizarre leads and clues associated with this case. And as far as I know, there haven't been any major developments for a long time. I was able to dig up an old Boston Globe article from a couple years ago, which claimed that Judith Rahn was still living in Florida, and she had apparently gotten so desperate that she started consulting psychics. One psychic actually told her that Laureen had been abducted by an Asian gang, was now living in Israel, had given birth to 2 children which she was forced to give up, and that she was eventually going to return home alive. Yeah, I have a really, really, really low opinion of so-called psychics who exploit the grief of victims' families like this, so I am not going to put a lot of stock into that theory of hers. But, quite frankly, it's going to be difficult to come up with a concrete theory about what happened. While researching this case, it often felt like I was reading through a Cliff Notes version of Laureen's disappearance, since it contained all these little tidbits of information which were lacking in specific details. But, working with what I have, I'm going to at least try to figure this whole thing out. Now, for starters, I'm pretty certain that Laureen did not run away. Given that she left virtually everything behind in her apartment and there were no signs of struggle, I think the most likely scenario was that she briefly stepped outside, or was lured outside, before she was taken against her will. Assuming that Laureen's female friend isn't lying about anything, it seems unlikely that Laureen would have been abducted from inside the apartment. I guess it's easy to suspect that Laureen's friends might be hiding something since they were involved in underage drinking that night, and her male friend quickly slipped out of the apartment and committed suicide a few years later. But I just don't think that the female friend would have stayed in the apartment and slept in Laureen's bed if she knew something bad had happened. So let's talk about the part where every single light bulb on all 3 floors of the apartment building was unscrewed, because that detail is just so friggin' bizarre and creepy. I could definitely see someone going to all that trouble to leave the hallway in total darkness. That way, when Laureen stepped out of the apartment, it would be easier to grab her. But if someone was specifically targeting Laureen, why would they unscrew the light bulbs on all 3 floors? It's certainly possible that some predator was planning to grab a victim at random, and Laureen just happened to be the first unfortunate person who stepped outside into the dark hallway. But I don't know, it's also possible the whole thing has nothing to do with this case. Maybe some prankster just decided to unscrew all the light bulbs that night as a joke, and it's just an eerie coincidence that a girl from that same building just happened to go missing. Let's also not overlook the fact that the apartment's back door was found unlocked, even though Laureen's male friend claimed he heard her lock the door behind him. It's possible that somebody could have knocked on the back door and abducted Laureen once she opened it. So what about the disappearances of Denise Deneau and Rachel Garden? Well, I'm inclined to believe that the Rachel Garden disappearance probably has nothing to do with Laureen's case, especially since they seem to have nailed down some possible suspects who might have killed Rachel. I do think it's possible that Denise Deneau's case might be connected, since it is quite a coincidence that she lived only 2 blocks away from Laureen and went missing just 6 weeks later. But again, I know 0 details about Denise's disappearance, and there's nothing available, so I can't make a definitive conclusion. However, I will say that I do believe that Laureen was still alive for some time after her disappearance, and that she actually did make those calls in California which showed up on her mother's phone bill. I can't say for certain that someone used a PIN number to charge those calls to Judith Rahn's number, but if that is the case, I just don't see how it could have been anyone but Laureen. By all accounts, the Rahn family had 0 ties to California, and I just find it unlikely that some other random person would get a hold of Judith's PIN number, travel to the other side of the country, and make a couple phone calls. I would think that if someone had stolen a PIN number for the purpose of running up a huge phone bill under someone else's number, they'd have used it to make more than 3 calls. Now, those anonymous silent phone calls Judith received over the next several years, it's certainly possible it could have been Laureen. Maybe Laureen got involved in something unsavory in California and wanted to come back home, but just didn't know what to say whenever she called her mother. However, I won't discount the possibility that these calls all could have been made by somebody who just wanted to torment the family. One detail I find very curious is that many of these calls would happen at around 3:45 a.m. Like I said earlier, the New Hampshire Department of Justice website claims that Judith contacted the police to report Laureen missing at 3:45 a.m. I don't know if that's just a coincidence or if some of this information is inaccurate, but if some sicko really wanted to torment Judith, I suppose a particularly twisted way to do it would be to call her in the middle of the night at the exact same time she reported her daughter missing. And this brings us to all the weird pornography stuff, which is tough to figure out since the details are so vague. For starters, I do not think that porn star Annie Sprinkle was involved in Laureen's disappearance. If by chance the two of them ever did cross paths at some point, Sprinkle probably wouldn't have known who Laureen was or that she was a missing girl. But the physician who ran this teen sexual assistance hotline, I find him shady as hell, especially since he initially denied knowing Laureen and then changed his story 5 years later. He didn't even provide any substantial information. He just told authorities, "Oh yeah, I kind of remember this girl who might have been from New Hampshire." And then he brings Annie Sprinkle's name into the mix for whatever reason. I guess it's possible that this guy might have had some sort of personal vendetta against Sprinkle and wanted to implicate her in sex trafficking. Who knows? But I find it interesting that this guy was a physician, and then the investigation brings up this mysterious child pornographer with the name Dr. Z. However, since I know so few details about this physician or Dr. Z, I have no idea if they could be one and the same. But if I had to formulate a theory about Laureen's disappearance, I'd say she was probably lured out of her apartment on the night she disappeared, where she was abducted and forced into either sex slavery or a pornography ring. I think she did eventually wind up in California and did make those phone calls which were charged to Judith's number. I can only speculate what happened to her afterwards, but I would not be surprised if she wanted to come back home and made a few attempts to contact her family. But by this point, Laureen might have been in such a terrible situation that she could not or would not tell her family what happened. I do believe that Laureen was alive for at least several months after she disappeared, but unfortunately, I'd say the chances of her still being alive today are pretty slim. But if she is still alive after all these years, I do hope she can somehow make contact with her family again and bring them closure. And that concludes our episode about one of the strangest missing persons cases I've ever studied. If you happen to have any important information about the disappearance of Laureen Rahn, or if by chance you're Laureen herself, please contact the appropriate authorities. And if you have your own theory about what might have happened to Laureen, I'd love to hear from you. Most importantly, if you happen to know more concrete details about some of the information I've covered here, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email, because I would really love to fill in the blanks. Hell, if you even have information about the disappearances of Denise Deneau or Rachel Garden, let me know, because as far as I can tell, those cases are still unsolved too. If you want to contact me, I can be reached at robin.warder@primus.ca. That's ROBIN.WARDER@PRIMUS.ca. So be sure to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and iTunes. You can also check out my true crime and mystery articles at both crack.com and listverse.com. And there's also plenty of other non-true crime content you can find right here at the back row. So have yourself a good 2 weeks, and join me next time for another edition of The Trail Went Cold. Thank you.